Hey, what's up guys? It's Graphic Phoenix back with a much requested video. This is a Leopard Gecko care sheet. So before we get into the care of these guys, we're going to talk about some general info, and let's get started with that. So for starters, they're the best beginner reptile, or certainly one of them. Both the bearded dragon and the crested gecko are equally as good as leopard geckos for beginner reptile keepers. What makes them so great for beginners is that they're very, very tame. They eat like no other. They are very hardy, and they're very available in the pet trade. They are commonly captive bred, so you don't have to worry about getting wild caught anymore. As well as the cost for these guys, the setup cost in Canada at least would probably run you anywhere from $100 all the way up into like a $200, $250. And if you really wanted to go cheap and have plastic tubs and everything like that, you could probably find a cheap setup for about $80. And that's brand new, not including like what Kijiji would have on it, or Craigslist for those of you in the States. The maintenance cost for these guys is not very high. They don't need much maintenance. You can change their substrate. Spot clean it whenever you see poo or feces or whatever you want to call them, and completely change the whole substrate 2 to 3 times a year is what I do it. And the geckos cost themselves, you can find these guys for like $25, $35. Maybe not in pet stores, but certainly with local breeders and stuff. But you can also find these guys as expensive as like $2,000. So whatever morph you guys are looking for, depending on how rare it is, they will get more expensive. Striker here is a high yellow leopard gecko, and he's about 11 years old. The lifespan on these guys is anywhere from about 15 to 25 years old. Some have been known to live to about 30 years old, but that's in rare occasions. That's pretty much all the general info that I had for these guys. They're just great pets, know that, and let's get into some care. Now that he's back inside, we can move on to care for the leopard geckos. Let's do it! Their scientific name is Eublophorus macularius. Don't blame me if I butchered that. I'm sorry. So let's just talk about how big they can get. So babies generally hatch out at about 3 inches long, maybe 4 inches depending on how big a baby you have. But that's generally where they hatch out as hatchlings. Very small, but big enough to chomp down crickets and do amazing. Whereas adult females can be generally about 7 to 8 inches long and anywhere from, I believe, about 65 to 80 grams at full size. Whereas males can be 8 to 10 inches long and be anywhere from like 80 to 100 grams safely. Striker here is about 105 grams, so he's a little chunky, but still in the healthy range. Caging for these guys is pretty easy and pretty straightforward. This is a 15-gallon that Striker's in, and that's the minimum I recommend for a leopard gecko, is a 15-gallon. However, some places you can find recommendations of a minimum cage being 10 gallons. Personally, I find that too small, so this is a 15-gallon. Now for breeding pairs, having 2 of them together, you'd want at least a 20-gallon and a good range of hides and stuff for the leopard gecko to hide in. As well for the caging, you want to make sure that they have a hot hide, which is this one, and we'll talk about temperatures after, as well as a cold hide, which is that one over there. Beginners especially should definitely have a humid hide for their leopard gecko. This mitigates the broken fingers and appendages on the leopard gecko. I didn't know that at first, so Striker does have stubbed toes, but I didn't know. Now I know, and he hasn't lost any toes since. Like I said, a humid hide will regulate that. Basically, you can use a Tupperware container, really anything that is able to retain moisture. To do that, you want to fill it with either moss, coconut fiber, or vermiculite to have that humid environment. They'll also get used to that for egg laying and stuff like that, so it's good to have it, especially with females, for egg laying season. Now we can move on to lighting and temperatures. As I was saying before, the hide that he's sitting right in front of now is actually his hot hide. And on top there is actually a heat rock. I don't recommend them on the ground for laying purposes, but because it's on top and it radiance heat down, that makes that his hot side. As well, he has a small heat pad under there to keep it nice and toasty. Speaking of nice and toasty, the hot temperatures should be about 86 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and for UK and Canadians, 30 to 32 degrees Celsius. Whereas the cold side should be room temperature, so basically anywhere from about 73 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 21 to 23 degrees Celsius. As I was mentioning before, heat is best produced by under the tank heat. There's two things you can find. There's heat cable or heat pads. Personally, I have a heat pad, and that seems to work good for me. However, there's tons of people that use heat cables, and it works just fine. Avoid the basking light simply because these guys generally like heat on their belly, not so much on the top of their bodies, so a basking light doesn't really do much for them. That's why I always recommend having a heat pad or heat cable. And as I was saying before, the heat rocks that are commonly available do generally get a little hot for these guys, so I say best avoid them to not have any burning. Nobody wants any burns on their reptile, especially not your brand new leopard gecko that you're thinking of getting. Now, lighting wise, like I said, no basking light. UVB. You do not need a UVB light. I have one provided for Striker. It's a 5.0 UVB light from Exoterra, I believe, and it works fine. They technically do not need it. They are nocturnal, so they don't require UVB lights. A lot of breeders don't have any lights in them at all, but since this is your pet, you're going to want to see it, and a low wattage light of any kind really can be used to produce light for viewing pleasure. So now we move on to substrate, which is a very, very controversial topic. I'll start with beginners and baby leopard geckos, and I'll move on to what I have and what I believe. So for beginners and babies especially, you want to have a not loose substrate, being tile, newspaper, no substrate at all, the like fake, I don't know if it's called AstroTurf, but like what they use on golf courses and stuff. Anything like that can be used for them. I do not recommend the reptile carpet. It's just not very good, and it is kind of a pain to clean all the time. That's my beliefs. Tiles, you can just spray them down and they're good and clean. Now for older lizards, like Striker here, loose substrates can be used, but just be wary. Impaction is always a risk, no matter what age they are. Anytime, anywhere, it's always a risk, especially with loose substrates. However, even with the risk of impaction there, I do use crushed walnut shells. You can find them at your local pet stores. They have done me very well. They're very good at absorbing smells and all that yucky stuff, so I like them for that. And as well, because impaction is such a possibility, I use tongs to feed them. These guys right here, you'll see later when I feed them. That's what I use. They work so well because I feed him off the ground so he doesn't get any loose substrate into his mouth. If he does, it's very small amounts and is easily passed through. Final wrap up about the substrate. Choose whatever you want to do. Just know that no matter what loose substrate you use, there is a risk of impaction. Keep that in mind, especially for the younger leopard geckos. Now food, nutrition. This is the exciting part. Live insects are a must. Leopard geckos are insectivores. They will pretty much only eat live insects. Don't even bother with dead insects. I offered them to Striker. He looked at them and turned his nose away. However, with live insects, as you'll see, they are gung-ho. Any legumes, vegetables, or fruit, don't even bother. It's not worth it. They won't do anything for your leopard gecko. Now for a staple diet, I feed Striker crickets. A lot of breeders and people that don't like crickets use mealworms, which are totally fine, but I feel that crickets are slightly more nutritious, especially with the gut load that I feed them. But that's my opinion. You can feed them whatever you want, either crickets or mealworms. As a treat, you can use waxworms or butterworms, but only maximum once every week, maybe 2 weeks. Just because they're very fattening and they can get addicted to them and refuse all other food. Now with feeding time, there is the calcium and multivitamin dusting. For me, I dust with this, the calcium plus low D Repashy calcium. Now this has no D3 or very low D3. It does have calcium D, but not specifically D3. Whereas this one, the mineral from Sticky Tongue Farms, which smells fantastic, it is calcium and mineral. This one does contain D3. So this one is my D3 supplement, and I use it as well with just a little bit of the multivitamin, and they seem to be very happy. In the feeding, you'll see it with this, that's all. Now, there are very, very many other different kinds of calcium. Just make sure you're providing no D3 at least once, maybe 2 times a week. I do it every feeding. And D3 with multivitamin once a month, maybe twice a month, depending on your feeding schedule. That's what I recommend. This is the shaker cup for the crickets that I feed Striker. And let's get to feeding now. That's the amount of crickets that I have in there. Now I'll add the calcium. And then you shake it all up. You can see the crickets are nice and evenly coated. And let's get feeding. Now I'm not going to show you the whole feeding process, but that's just a couple of him eating and to show you how I feed them with the tongs. Now on an average feeding, I'll feed him anywhere from 8 to 10 5-week-old crickets. Obviously the smaller ones will eat smaller crickets, like 3 weeks generally is where I recommend starting. And never ever ever dump all of your crickets into the cage at the same time. If you do, make sure you clean them up after about an hour of free roaming. The reason for this is there's horror stories all over that have leopard geckos have been hurt, have been killed, have been any of that due to the crickets eating them. Crickets are not friendly, they're not very fun, and it's just a warning. Don't mean to scare anyone that's new to leopard geckos or reptile keeping in general, but just make sure you either tong feed or remove all uneaten crickets after a couple hours. Now we're pretty much wrapping up the care sheet. We have watering left. Now I always have a water bowl, as you can see right there. Now for water, as you saw, I have it always there and always available to him. You might not see them drink all the time, but I do frequently catch him lapping some water down, and he does it for a substantial amount of time. So it's obviously needed. You want to keep it in there and available to them at all times. To the water, never add anything. You never want to add any extra calcium or anything like that. They should be getting enough from their diet and don't need the extra from their water. Alright guys, I believe that wraps up my care sheet for leopard geckos. We've covered their general info, their size, their caging, lighting and temperatures, their substrate, the food, and water. I believe that covers everything. So I'd like to thank you for watching. I know this was a very requested video, and people really wanted to see my care sheet of leopard geckos, so now you have it. If you want to see what I'm doing and keep up with me, talk to me on a more personal level, you can follow my Facebook page. It's called Alpha Reptiles. I'll leave a link down below. If you did like the video and want to see more care sheets or any videos of any kind, do drop a like down below. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, things you might know that I didn't add, drop them in the comments down below. As well, if you want to see more reptile videos, as well as maybe more variety coming in the future, subscribe to my channel, and with that yawn, I'm out of here.